So welcome everyone to our development dialogues today. We are so excited to have this conversation with everybody. It's a very important topic, right? We talk about participation in development and how we can strengthen community-led development. This is the event that co-organized by the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to development. I'm sure all of us know Professor Surya very well, and together with International Accountability Project and the Coalition for Human Rights in Development. I think just a bit of background. My name is Tom Wirashat, and I work with International Accountability Project, and I work with the Global Advocacy Team on Community-Led Development Planning. And I think that's the reason we are here today, because we truly believe in the community to lead development process in the way that they want to define, design, and the development that will shape their own future, right? We talk a lot about problem with development, and at IAP, we ask ourselves, what might development what if it's to designed and lived by the same people? What that would look like? And through the Global Advocacy Team initiative, focusing on community-led development planning, and we have Julia. She will share more experience about that. And I just want to put some of the resources that everyone can access, and we can put the link in the slides so you all can see and learn. We have 7 community-led development plans from 7 countries around the world that are member of the Global Advocacy Team. Welcome everyone for joining us. We have great speakers today. I just want to, let you all know that we will structure this dialogue by 2 rounds of our amazing speakers sharing their perspective and experience, telling us some stories. And between the 2 rounds, we'll have a few minutes, and I will invite you all to share some thoughts about community-led development. We have some online tools like Mentimeter, but you can always put in the chats. Don't worry about technology at all. And then we'll go to second round. And then after that, we'll have a chance to ask some questions. You will be invited to share, to write down your questions, and I will make sure our speakers addressed hopefully some of them. I'm sure this dialogue will spark a lot of great questions. Yes, if you have any concern, any questions, please feel free to put them in the chats. Great. So it's my pleasure to introduce you all to our speakers today. We have 3 speakers with us. The first I have a chance to work with is Julia. Julia is the project coordinator with the Center for Community Mobilization and Support NGO from Armenia. And Julia and her organization is a part of the Global Advocacy Team on Community-Led Development Planning. And over the past year, Julia has a lot of extensive experience. She participated in many conferences and training locally and internationally to advance community-led development. So it's a pleasure to see you today, Julia, and thanks for joining us today. And the next speaker is Roby. So Roby Halip is with the Right Energy Partnership. I've known Roby for years, and Roby is from indigenous peoples from the Cordillera region from the Philippines. And Roby is a dedicated advocate for indigenous peoples' rights, and she works to promote indigenous self-determination, cultural preservation, and sustainable development at global and regional platforms. Roby is the executive director of the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples. which champions indigenous-led solutions. Today, we'll get a chance to hear Robbie and her partners and the team direct experience on how indigenous-led solution can lead development, especially in renewable energy, right? Her works will highlight the importance of recognizing indigenous peoples' rights while addressing some of the just and sustainable future for all. The other speaker that we have today is Patrick Barron. Patrick is the Senior Social Development Specialist with the World Bank. Patrick is the global lead for community-led, Patrick is the World Bank Global Lead for Community and Local Development and Social Cohesion and Resilience within the Social Development Global Department. I hope Patrick has joined us. It's early in Washington, D.C., I think. Patrick was previously the lead regional advisor with the World Bank project in Asia, and his work focused on peace process, and he works across the region in Thailand, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia, and Afghanistan. And Patrick has worked with NGOs in Cambodia and China, and was the regional director for the Asia Foundation. And all right. Well, as I mentioned, we'll start out with the first round of the conversation. I think, Anki, we can take down the share screen so we can see Julia more clear. Thank you. Well, Julia, I'd like to start with you, but the same question would go to Robbie and Patrick. We get to hear different experience and perspective. Julia, in your experience, and in about 5 minutes from now, could you help us, what defines community-led development for you, and what make it truly community-led? Is there any story that you can share with us where community can drive meaningful development through this approach, right? What made it successful? Let's hear some of that story. Over to you, Julia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tom, for the question. So community-led development is a process started and driven by local residents themselves. It actively involves all stakeholders and beneficiaries, ensuring broad participation across all social groups within the community. So this inclusive approach reflects the belief that those who live in that place are best positioned to shape its future. However, communities are not always given this right. In many cases, they face unfair treatment when outside actors push development paths that go against their values, ideas, and understanding of a good life. A common example is the experience of many rural communities facing mining projects, for example, in Armenia. These projects often put their environment, public health, and traditional ways of living at risk. Another example is when local authorities responsible for carrying out development are disconnected from the real needs of their communities. And in such cases, strategies are created without meaningful local input and fail to reflect local priorities. So it is often under such pressure that communities take the lead and start their own development processes. Sadly, these grassroots movements often appear during times of crisis, when communities are forced to defend their rights or push back against harmful projects, yes? So, yet they also show strong examples of local leadership and civic awakening. Armenia has seen several such examples. We can name the village of Marts, Gogara, Shenavan, Aygezart, where community members have taken development into their own hands. For example, currently in Aygezart, residents are working on a community strategy based on their own needs and goals. And these villages share a common story, the serious threat of mining operations that went against their hopes for the future. So as we worked in Mart's village in our region, in Lori region, within like in the scope of global advocacy team projects, for years, residents there resisted mining companies trying to use local resources. Their struggle was not a one-time protest. It was a long-term effort based on a shared vision. They understood that the projects coming from outside did not match their hopes for farming, ecotourism, and a clean, healthy environment. So through this resistance, the community came to an important realization. To protect their way of life, they needed to lead their own development. This meant understanding their needs, involving all social groups, and creating a plan that reflected their values and long-term goals, one that would be taken into account by the local government in all future development plans for their community. Such a strategy becomes more than just a plan. It becomes a form of protection. It gives communities the strength to stand against future threats by clearly showing what kind of development they want and why. But to start this kind of leadership processes, certain conditions must be met. A sense of civic awareness, care for the environment, and partnerships with supportive experts and organizations. So what we can learn from these processes, these community-led efforts offer valuable lessons for others, how to organize and come together around shared values, how to carry out inclusive needs assessments across different social groups, how to build strong, effective public campaigns to protect rights, how to make sure that community voices are heard by authorities and the wider public. So at the heart, we can say that at the heart of community-led development is a simple but powerful idea. Communities must be the authors of their own futures. Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you so much, Julia. That's very illuminating experience from the works from Matt's village and other community that you work with. You raise a very resonating point to me that this is something that people have to fight for, right? And fight to maintain. That's right, to be part of development. Next, I'd like to go to Roby to share your experience, Roby. And we got some great question in the chat. Thank you so much. Someone asks about the consultation, free, prior, informed consent. I think, Roby, you would be the perfect person to touch on that. Over to you, Roby. And if we could have Patrick join us on the screen as well, if that's possible. Please,
Yeah,
Roby.
I'm on the screen, Tom. I don't know if you can see me, but my video.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. There you are. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to this dialogue. Just briefly on the work of the right energy. There's someone on. Just quickly on the work of the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples. This was established in 2018 as an offshoot, actually, of our engagement in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, particularly on SDG 7, where discussions in relation to renewable energy was more on deploying large scale renewable energy projects, heightened mining of critical minerals, and clean cooking technologies, but nothing on human rights. So for us indigenous peoples, we've been hosting a lot of large dams, a lot of mining projects, and it has severely impacted our territories. And now with this climate solutions that are being proposed, we are again threatened and further pushed to the margins without recognizing our aspirations also for development. Now that leads me to from the indigenous perspective, what we mean by indigenous peoples led development. For us, indigenous peoples, the development that we want is anchored to our right to self-determination and the realization of our rights as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This means that the agency of indigenous peoples, including women and youth, are recognized to lead their own development aspirations. And this is anchored in our values on sustainability and reciprocity, giving back to Mother Earth that gives the resources and sustenance for our communities. And it's not anchored on market-based and profit-driven schemes. No, I think an important component also of indigenous peoples-led development is one that recognizes also that indigenous peoples have the right to determine the development that they want. And if there are projects coming into our territories, free, prior, and informed consent needs to be implemented to make sure that development interventions are aligned to our needs and priorities. Now, for some examples on how indigenous peoples-led development on renewable energy is being exercised, one example that I would give you would be the geothermal power project in New Zealand, the Tauhara Trust. In this instance, the indigenous peoples there are in a situation where they are not threatened by militarization, they are not threatened by projects, no? And this project, co-owned renewable energy project that they are implementing, it's them who is at the driving seat. It's them who defines how royalty will be done, the lease on their land that's being used, and also the regular review of agreements between the community and the project proponent, because that's an important part also when it's co-ownership, direct partnership with indigenous peoples, that agreements are not set in stone but are also regularly reviewed to see the implementation and see if it needs to be renewed or amended. But the second example that I'll be giving you is the one we were working in Malaysia. No? And this area is continuously being threatened by the construction of a large dam. Now, through the help of Tonibung, it's a local indigenous peoples-led organization that's been working on renewable energy for more than 2 decades now. They help the community develop their own renewable energy system, but that's looking not only at access to energy for the community, but also looking at the productive end use of this renewable energy system, supporting the traditional livelihood of indigenous communities, and in the larger scale, supporting the strengthening of the defense of land rights and resources of indigenous peoples. Because when we look at development as indigenous peoples, it's not only in one aspect, but really to maintain and sustain our lands and resources, not only for us, but also for the future generations of indigenous peoples. So those are my thoughts on the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roby, for grounding us on how the indigenous peoples and community have already been practicing, exercising their rights to determination and, to co-own the project that will benefit them. Before I go to Patrick, I'd like to gently remind everyone there are several language interpretation if you want to choose your own language. And also please mute your microphone so we can focus on our speakers. Patrick, is there any story, any experience that you'd like to share with us today? I think you have, a broader experience and perspective of being at the World Bank. What defined community-led development for you and as in the institutions, what it make it truly community-led?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you so much for the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts today. For me, it's quite simple. Community-led development is where communities have full ownership over development projects and the development process. It's not about where they're consulted, but it's about where they are the ones with the steering wheel to decide what exactly resources are used and how. And so at the World Bank, we call this community and local development, or sometimes community-driven development. And just to give you a sense of what these projects look like, right? So typically what we do is we provide grants of money to villages. And then there is the process where facilitators help villagers work out what their priority needs are. There's a menu of activities that they can use the money for, whether it's a road or a clinic, whatever is the most important in their community. And then communities will decide together how to use that money and are often involved in implementing the projects as well. And I think important as well is the role of the facilitators, because they need to also help ensure that the marginalized and the vulnerable within communities are involved in this process. You know, if you just put money into a community and you don't really have an inclusive process, maybe elites or others can capture that. And so this is actually a big line of what the World Bank does. We have at the moment over $52 billion worth of projects that are doing this type of work around the world. That's about 10% of what the World Bank does overall. So these projects that are putting money into communities for communities to decide what they want to use it for. Sometimes they're multi-sectoral projects, so communities can choose from a very open list of things. Sometimes they're focused maybe on water or agriculture or something like that. So I think it's an interesting question why we do so much of this, because, you know, the World Bank works with governments, right? That's the main way in which we work. And you might not think that governments would always want to do this, right? That they'd want to work through their own systems, that they wouldn't necessarily want communities to have this level of ownership. But I think there's a number of reasons. I mean, one is it's proven to be quite effective, right? So all the impact evaluations we have show that this approach tends to be much more effective than just putting money through line ministries. Often it's cheaper, there's less corruption. Communities are putting in their own time and effort as well, which brings down costs. And I think also, understandably, the programs are pretty popular with communities by and large. You know, people feel a sense of ownership that they may not with a project that's kind of given to them rather than one they decide. I think there's also growing recognition that this type of approach can help build local capacities and institutions as well, right? That can have impacts down the line. And often a lot of our projects are of this type are in countries that are affected by conflict, where maybe you don't have local governments that are functioning or trusted or seen as legitimate. And this is a way to get resources down in a clean way that helps communities. So I could give you a whole number of examples, but let me just start with one about Afghanistan. So we had a program called the National Solidarity Program that started up in the early 2000s, and that provided money. It went through the government, but they contracted a series of international NGOs who did facilitation work at the local level. And that program was able to keep going all throughout the war, including in the south in places like Helmand. And we actually did some interesting studies where Taliban-controlled areas, they were destroying infrastructure built by a lot of government projects, but they weren't destroying infrastructure built by the National Solidarity Program. And so in trying to understand why, it was because communities felt ownership over this and said, no, you know, okay, the money may come from the government, but this is our project. This is what we built ourselves. And because of that, it was able to keep going, even in some of the areas where conflict was at the highest. And then after the Taliban authorities took over and the World Bank no longer works with the government authorities, there were institutions that had been built there that were still able to use a similar methodology. And I think now they're working 6 or 7 programs across health, education using these sort of methods. So I think, the approach can be quite effective. It's been a very positive experience at the World Bank, and I'd love to share more in questions and in the second round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing your insights and experience. I think got quite interesting for people. The chat is quite busy. There are already a couple of questions for, I think some of them direct to Patrick. And thanks so much, Julia, Robbie, and Patrick, for giving us your unique and different perspectives. And now I'd like to go back to everybody in this room, not just our speakers. We'll take a few minutes if you'd like to share, and we can drop a link to the online tool, Mentimeter, but you can feel free to put in the chat some of your thoughts. After hearing these, insightful perspective and experience, what is one word or a feeling that you associate with when you hear community-led development, or after hearing our speakers sharing? If you want to join us on Mentimeter, there's a link in the chat. You can click on it and you can add your response, and then we can see it together. Or feel free to drop in the chat as well your answer. What are your thoughts? What are your feeling that associate with community-led development? Great. Ownership. Yes. And please keep them coming. We can, and feel free to write in any language that you want. This is our collective sharing before we move to the next round, just to check in the room. We got some questions already in the chat, and we'll have to get some time to go through them after the next round as well. We've got some interesting words here: agency participation, sustainable solution, influence, yes, sense of belonging. That's great. Let me look in the chat. In the chat, we got some great points as well. Empowering people, profits, thank you, inclusion, governance, democracy. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts. You can continue to add on the Mentimeter or in the chat, but I'd like to go to the next questions, to go back to our speaker, to Robbie, Patrick, and Julia. As you all mentioned, right? These shift in development, even with the World Bank, Patrick said, the portion of the budget go through this model of development, and we see that the community are continue to fight for the right to be part of community-led development to shape this model. What change need to happen, you think, like some structural in the law, policy, governance, or in funding system? What need to shift or change so that the community would have more power, more access to lead development process in a meaningful way? I'm not sure amongst the audience participant today if there is any government, donor, or other stakeholders listening here, but if they are here, what would you suggest, right? What would you want them to do to support this shift so that community-led development become the mainstream, not just an alternative? What is the first thing that we should do to change so that community can lead development process? And I'd like to go back to Julia to start us off. Julia, please, and then I'll go to Patrick and then to Robbie.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that interesting question. So, local self-government in Armenia remains an institution in development. In many cases, local authorities do not fully use their powers legally given to them. And at the same time, their independence is often weakened by state-level decisions and processes that overshadow or go beyond local governance. So this raises serious questions about the real independence of communities when it comes to shaping their own future. We believe that the independence of local self-government and the right of communities to guide their own development must be protected and strengthened through strong local policies. There have been important examples in Armenia where community-led decisions based on local needs and strategies have tried to guide development in a direction that reflects the community's vision. For instance, some local governments, guided by strategies developed with the participation of residents, have decided to ban mining activities within their areas. So these decisions were based on long-term social and environmental development goals, but however, in several cases, such local decisions were challenged by the national government in court, which weakened local self-government and blocked sustainable community-led development. So another strong example, I can bring one of our communities in our region, Ozun community, which once adopted a social ecological local policy through the Council of Elders. But this policy described a development path based on the community's priorities and needs and stood as a model of a planning. Yes, but unfortunately, after the administrative merger of Ozun with other villages in one community, this policy seems to have been ignored, and it affected over 10 other communities that had originally benefited from that vision. So these cases show the urgent need to strengthen the importance and power of local policies. Community-driven policies should not be pushed aside or replaced by national strategies that do not reflect local realities. For example, if a national strategy supports mining in a certain region, but the local community has adopted a policy rejecting such activity, the national plan should not cancel out the community's choice. Local decisions must come first when they are the result of democratic participatory processes. And in short, community policies should carry more weight than outside agendas. So they reflect the real needs and priorities of residents. If a community decides on a certain path of development, that decision should be respected, not challenged or weakened. The true spirit of local self-government lies in allowing communities to make and act on decisions that match their values, needs, and hopes for their future. And I would like to mention also one very important and current issue in Armenia regarding policies and governance. In Armenia, eco-activists and environmentalists face various forms of pressure from different groups recently during last years, especially from mining companies through SLAP lawsuits. So in this case, it's also very important that Armenia adopt anti-SLAP legislative reforms to protect activists, so that people feel free to express themselves or to guide and to create their future in a democratic country. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julia. That's so important. It's so critical, right? It's a very fundamental to be able for the community to express themselves freely, to be able to lead the process. And we also got some great comments and questions in the chat. I'm so glad everyone joining us. And I'd like to then go to Patrick with the same question. Patrick, like in your perspective, what do you think need to shift or change for this to happen, more widely or more deeply?
Yeah, so I think ultimately what we want to do is to change systems and change institutions, right? We can have a lot of good development projects that help people, but if the broader system is functioning in a different way, then there's limits to what you can achieve, right? So I just wanted to reflect a little bit on one experience we had in Indonesia, which was going from what started as a relatively small community-driven development project to a national project to a full-on policy reform, right? And this was a program called the Kecamatan Development Program, which started in 1988. So this was at the time of the fall of General Suharto. Indonesia was trying to democratize. The government systems were fairly rotten in terms of corruption. And so this was a way to pilot a way of putting money into communities where they had ownership over that, right? And, gradually we saw really good results coming in from this. There was interest from the new government in this, so it expanded, eventually reaching about 40,000 villages, which is about half of the Indonesian archipelago. The government then said, look, this is working well. We want to take it national, including urban areas. So they transformed it into a program called the PMPM, the Program Nasional Masyarakat Pembangunan, National Community Development Program. But then I think the big breakthrough was in 2014, when the government passed into legislation a new village law, which mandated that a proportion of the national budget was going to go directly to villages using this participatory approach at the local level, where villages had control to decide how that money was used. And what this meant is that now within the whole fiscal architecture of the government, they have something called the Dana Desa, the village grant, that villages receive from the national budget every year. And this is not small money. I mean, I think as of last year, it was 4.6 billion US dollars per year go directly to villages, not through local governments, go directly to villages. Villages have elected committees at the local level to manage that with many checks and balances. And since 2015, it's almost $40 billion have gone down that way. This is the largest village transfer in the world, right? I think something Indonesia should be proud of. Now, it's not that not that everything's perfect. I'm sure there's instances where village heads will manage to capture money, where groups get excluded and so on. But I think as a lesson learned, this is the way we should be going, right? Which is going from micro projects to larger projects to really changing government systems so that communities have voice. And I think it's a really interesting case study that's still to be written, I think, on why this was able to happen. I think it was a mixture of demonstrated effectiveness, a lot of really high quality impact evaluations, showing the economic returns, showing the improvement in services that you get from this. I think it was the product of 30 years of engagement from the World Bank and many civil society organizations. And I think this is another lesson. This is a long-term struggle, right? It's not something you change overnight. And as I said, bringing in the civil society elements as well. This wasn't just about the government and the World Bank, but about civil society playing elements, both in helping deliver projects, and we had some really great work with groups like PECA doing work around female-headed households, but obviously on the advocacy side as well. So that's just one country. I think there's other countries I know well that have gone through a similar trajectory, but I think that's ultimately what we should be aiming for.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing quite interesting example of how the initiative could scale up and can be used widely, and that's a very important point, which I'd like to direct us to Robbie to is any insight you can share. I think you have a lot of experience, and I can see also in the chat people are resonating with what's happening, what we are sharing. Robbie, please.
Thank you. First on my end is the change of mindset. No, for Indigenous peoples, we are not just vulnerable, we are not just marginalized communities that needs to be empowered, that needs to be provided all these development interventions. No? We are rights holders, and we have the agency to really advance our development aspirations, as I mentioned earlier. Because unless we change that mindset, and unless we also understand where Indigenous peoples are coming from in terms of the development that we want, we will not get anywhere. That's the first step. And I think the second step is even if a lot of countries have adhered or adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, at the country level, the situation of Indigenous peoples is not improving. And it's important that for Indigenous peoples to advance their own self-determined development, laws and policies have to be put in place that recognizes Indigenous people's rights. But on the other hand, also laws and policies that are not aligned to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and international human rights standards should be repealed and amended. No, it's not just putting in place enabling frameworks, laws, and policies, but also reviewing these repressive laws that really causes more further marginalization of Indigenous peoples and other communities. And the third point from my end, because this is a growing concern not only for Indigenous peoples, but also for community workers, community organizations, is the growing vilification of even Indigenous peoples-led initiatives. An example is here in the Philippines, where a community is managing their own microhydro system to support their access to energy and livelihood. But even these renewable energy systems are being vilified by the states in saying that this is a project that's being led by communist insurgents. I think we will not be able to move forward in really advancing a genuine Indigenous peoples led development if the democratic space is not there, if peace and security issues are not addressed. And that's the reality for many communities, for many Indigenous peoples. In Asia, Africa, and also in Latin America, we've seen the report from Global Witness where still Indigenous peoples top the number of people who are killed because they are defending their lands and resources from imposed development interventions. And as I said earlier, if the enabling conditions are there, like in the case of New Zealand, where they are not militarized, they're able to really fully exercise their rights, they're able to fully exercise their development aspirations. But the case of the Philippines, the case of Indonesia, the case of other Asian countries where we are facing a lot of peace and security threats, we are facing a lot of imposed development projects. It's really, we're in a survival mode, but still we persist also to push for our Indigenous peoples-led development. And with the right energy partnership with Indigenous peoples, we're hoping really that we could strengthen partnerships not only with states, but also with the private sector bearing in mind that the call of indigenous peoples is direct partnership and direct access to finance, which means this also gives us the agency to define and design development projects that will be implemented in our territories. It's not a project that's designed from the top and then just telling indigenous peoples to submit a proposal. Now, that's not how it goes for indigenous peoples. Development priorities have to be defined by the people for it to be really peoples-led development. Otherwise, if priorities are still defined by states from people at the top, and then people will just be asked to submit proposals and requirements are still so rigid, it's not possible to realize genuine peoples-led development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robbie, for sharing that very insightful and, I think summarize a lot of what we've been talking today. And I'd like to thank also everyone that joining us in the chat. Many great comments and some of the very powerful questions, which I actually want to shift the next 5 minutes. Let's hear some of the questions, some of the reflection. We can have Mentimeter up and everyone can join in that, or feel free to put in the chat as well. Because of the short time, I've seen some of the questions addressing, one that I've seen is, what would it take for a large-scale system and institutions to not only adopt this shift and narrative, but to embed them meaningfully in the funding, design, and the evaluation of community development? And some other question is about the care. That's very interesting. The right to care, important, right? The local development should consider that caregiving, carrying out by certain group and population in the community that hinder their participations, and how we could address that. Yes, feel free to add your questions and comments in the chats. And I'd like to invite Julia, Robbie, and Patrick to also go through some of them in the chat as well. Community development has become a buzzword and elitist language of sorts. That's some of the interesting comment. What would the building block of effective participation in community development entail in development projects? And how do we go beyond a tick box exercise of participation and attendance? That's a good questions as well. Let's see here, and we got some. Let's see here. Julia, Patrick, or Robbie, I don't know if you'd like to respond to some of that questions. I think we can go through all of them, but maybe your overall impression or reflection, as some of our friends today have shared their thoughts.
Sure, Tom. I'm happy to have a go, and apologies if I missed any. I see a few are directed to me. So first, a very practical one: is there a website or resources about the work we do? There is. I don't know if Juliet from our team is online. If so, she can post it. If not, we can share with you, and you can share. We have a website. We also have an active community of practice, which is both within the World Bank and outside, where we share resources and have talks and stuff. And it'd be great if any of you want to join. Complaints mechanisms. So every World Bank project has a grievance handling system. And you'll see whenever we approve projects, we have what we call project appraisal documents, which are publicly disclosed. You can find on the web, and they will have information on that, right? But in my opinion, a lot of that's quite formulaic. It's like a number in Washington to call. I think a proper complaint system, you need much more than that, right? You need a whole system that flows in ways that communities feel comfortable going through. And typically we build in grievance systems, have grievance officers, where you use a whole range of things from, you know, anonymous text messaging, WhatsApp, mailboxes, and so on. And I think that's really, really important, right? Because there's always going to be some problems. In fact, I would worry if there were no problems being reported in a project. That shows that you just don't know about the problems rather than the problems not existed. So yes, there are. And if you look at the documentation, you can find ways about that. I saw in the chat as well, there was a question about grants versus loans. So I think we can think about this at two levels, right? So in terms of the communities themselves, it's always a grant, right? They're not paying back what they get. In terms of what the country, the government overall is getting, it depends on how poor the country is. So the poorest countries get grants. The upper middle income countries like your Thailands, the Indonesias, Philippines, they get low interest loans that are paid back at terms. But the reasons governments want to borrow is because typically they can do that cheaper than borrowing in the market, right? So I guess it's an indirect effect in that taxpayers are paying back over time, but the communities who receive the money are not paying back. And then I think there was a question as well, maybe I'm not phrasing it right, about how to make sure the money's not diverted by kind of people who are not from the community or corrupt local leaders. And I think this is where the importance of facilitation and supervision comes in, right? So typically these projects, they elect village development committees at the local level that normally have a quota of men versus women, make sure that you've got, you know, various marginalized groups in there. And then in order to access the money from the bank, normally multiple signatures are needed. You have a committee, separate committee that does oversight as well. And so, you know, it's not foolproof, right? I'm sure there's cases where money gets diverted, where some people benefit at the expense of others. But I think if you just think, oh, because I'm giving the money to the village, that means everyone's going to benefit, that's a little naive, right? And you've got to build in those checks and balances and have the facilitation to make sure everyone participates and benefits. So I'll leave it at that. If there's any other big questions I missed, please come back to me.
Thanks so much. And we are collecting these questions and finds way to you know, share some of response. Roby, you have addressed some of the questions in the chat. I wonder if you have anything to
Yes.
in a minute. Yeah.
Yes. I'd just like to comment on some and respond to some of the comments and questions that came in. No? One on the uniform approach, and that when we talk about community-led development or indigenous peoples-led development, it's really context specific, and that's the only way we can go to really have sustainable development. Because unless we change the system of how the development paradigm is being implemented, it will continuously marginalize the people, especially those at the grassroots level. So it's time to shift this kind of development thinking into having a uniform approach to make work easier. No, there's no shortcut to a just and sustainable development for the people. You really have to go down and address context-specific, people-specific development aspirations and priorities, including the intersections within communities. Because for indigenous peoples, it's not just one aspect you're looking at. You have to look at the intersectionalities of what are the development aspirations of women, of youth, of the persons with disabilities, and other marginalized groups within the community. You really have to address those to really be able to realize just and sustainable development. I think the second point I'd want to respond to is on strategies to sustain community-led development, because the example that I shared earlier in Malaysia, it's actually a community that's being threatened by Papag Dam, and managed they've managed to stop the construction of the dam in their communities because it would inundate not only their source of livelihood but also their lands. Now, through an indigenous peoples-led renewable energy system, particularly microhydro and solar dryers that were retrofitted for the drying of their non-timber products, these technologies help them to actually address the economic and energy needs of their communities. And now they are able to focus more in advocating for the recognition and respect of their rights against this dam that's being proposed by the government. So those are some of my comments and
Thank you.
responses. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ruby. Julia, any final words and I'd like to invite Professor Surya to give up some of his thoughts as we close the session today.
Yes, sure. There are very interesting questions in the chat, but one was directed to me after my response about non-democratic country, how this community-led development and all the work with local self-government and state government is going. It's a bit difficult for me to talk about it because I'm coming more or less from a democratic country, like a bit more democratic country, but I can share just an example from our previous work. And it was in 2015 when there was a SOSMED IRUM public campaign. And at that time, Armenia was not a democratic country. There was a lot of corruption, pressure on citizens. So it was not easy to do all of that. But in that community, there was a tailing dump, and the government, like the mining company, wanted to open the second one. So against this, there was a huge mobilization of the community. People living in that village, in that community, they all mobilized and became a joint power to fight against it. And a lot of mass media, a lot of experts, a lot of other stakeholders, like people interested in that process, were involved. And all that process, of course, that public campaign had a leader. So it was a precedent in Armenia. It was the first time that people got mobilized and they won the process. At the end, they won the process, and the tailing dam was not constructed. The government listened to them, and there was a very big visibility of that campaign. A lot of mass media was involved, and a lot of people, all country was speaking about it. So that's a very good example of community mobilization and joint power. And there was also another question which I would like to address about.
I'm sorry, I'm mindful of the time. Maybe we could share something in writing after. Thanks so much, Julia.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Professor Surya, and I'd like to thank you for hosting the dialogue today, Professor Surya. Would you like to share some of the closing thoughts for us before we say goodbye today? Please.
Thank you very much, Tom. I hope you can hear me. I mean, in the interest of time, I'll be very brief. First of all, thank you to IAP for joining forces with my mandate to co-organize this event. Very much appreciated. Thanks to all the speakers, as well as you as a moderator, Tom, and all the participants for asking questions. Ideally, I would have liked more engagement with the questions. A lot of good questions posed in the chat. Maybe we need to find a way to respond to these very meaningful questions. Let me say this, that most of the challenges that I see in the world are related to the model of development that we have. And in my view, the current model of development is highly problematic because it is creating inequalities It is triggering conflicts and it is not operating within planetary boundaries. And I think that's where the community-led development, community-driven development, or what I'm calling it, planet-centered participatory model of development. I think that's where we need. Next year, my report is going to provide concrete guidance on what the participation in development should look like. And that's where Right to Development provides clear guidance, because it talks about active, free, and meaningful participation of people in decision-making process. So I very much look forward to collaborating with you all to develop that guidance. Thank you once again for this dialogue.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all our speakers, Julia, Roby, and Patrick, for sharing your wisdom with us today. And thanks all of our participants today and all our co-organizers, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Development, IAP team, and the Coalition for Human Rights in Development. And I'd like to also thank our friends Vaishnavi and Choira for organizing, initiating this together. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and take care. We'll send you follow-up materials with all resources mentioned. You will hear from us. Thank you and goodbye, everyone.